This is all of our own opinions, none of our employers. So this event is not affiliated with Microsoft. So again, if you claim to hear anything from me and Ryan that says, hey, Microsoft said this, we'll deny everything. Also, that goes for our speakers tonight. They both work for companies. They are both doing it off their own backs. So nothing is affiliated with their brands.
As always, we run our diversity charter. If you feel like any of these values aren't being upheld, just let me or Jack know, and we'll sort it out. But anyone is welcome to this user group.
Yeah, at any time, even if that's via email or after the event, please do let us know. We absolutely, this is of utmost importance to both of us. So if you don't feel welcome or included, please let us know.
Quick shout out to Silicon Brighton. We've got Steve, the founder here, supporting us. Charlie from the AV team. Couldn't run these events without you, so thank you very much. Check out all the other user groups that Silicon Brighton run as well.
And on that exact note, there's a couple of new user groups. So Brighton AI is very new with the Silicon Brighton community. AI obviously being something that all of us are showing an interest in or being force-fed. Is another way of wording that. But a great topic, highly recommend heading along. This sounds like a great session. I couldn't make the first one, but I understand it was quite well attended, the first Brighton AI. Definitely head down. That's a platform 9 in Hove, so opposite Fika, Hicks and Green, like all that sort of areas. The old Albion pub reference. There we know. Good, Charlie. And also Tech Jumpstart, which Ryan has talked at before, run by Dan. A great event for any of you new to tech or trying to get into the industry and looking to how to, maybe do something new in your career. These are great meetups, and you were part of the panel, right, for these before?
Yeah, the sessions are kind of really devised to welcome people into IT and understand, like, you don't always have to have experience or qualifications. There's lots of roles available to you, and it's good to hear people's career journeys and how they got into it as well. So.
And then a few thank yous. So we are in an amazing new venue. So well done for everybody for finding it and not going to the wrong venue. Did send an email yesterday and a pin in the WhatsApp group. So, Johnny, you didn't. It's all that matters. You were here on time. But Runway East, so another great co-working space. They sponsored the pizzas tonight as well as providing the space. So thank you very much to the Runway East team. For those of you who don't know what Runway East are, they're trying to, they've got one of these in London and Bristol and now Brighton, obviously. We are in it. They're trying to break up what boring offices mean, right? To try to make workspaces fun. And they host high growth startups, SMEs, pretty much anybody who's up to a sort of 100 people in company size. So there's lots of spaces for little breakout rooms and little offices, lots of great space. So if your business is looking for a new home or you're starting up, then please do check out Runway East. We couldn't run these events without them, and thanks again for the pizza. And yeah, if you're interested in learning more, reach out to myself, Ryan, or one of the Silicon Brighton team. We'll be happy to put you in touch with the Runway East team.
Yeah, absolutely. Another shout out to Cora, local MSP. The guys from Cora here tonight. They've helped us with some drinks budget and everything else. A load of us used to work there. They offer some really good IT services locally. So Mark and Sat here from Cora if you need any IT help, projects, support, all that kind of stuff.
But yeah, thank you for the drinks and again for helping out last month as well. Much appreciated.
Yes. So this is our final meetup of the year in November. Some of you would have come to John Craddock's identity talks. He's going to run another one. We think we're still kind of working out the dates. It's probably going to be towards the end of November.
We were saying 22nd earlier. Is that what
possibly on a Wednesday, just around working around availability. But we're probably going to do a bit of maybe a Christmas. I haven't talked to you about this actually. I'm just making it up. Maybe a Christmas drinks. It makes sense to maybe we'll do a pub thing or something like that. Maybe the open mic thing that we said, or just some quick kind of. I'm just making shit up now. So.
Yeah, but yeah, John does want to come and talk about what's new in Entra. I know, Johnny, you showed interest in the whole Entra secure private access and secure access edge stuff that they were doing. Obviously, this is just after Ignite as well, so we'll be able to do a bit of an Ignite recap on what's gone on, and hopefully there'll be some more announcements around Entra and improving its products as well, like in terms of what's being announced already. But again, if anybody has any other ideas and you want to talk and you have a topic you want to share, please do come and let us know. Just like our fabulous speakers tonight that we'll get onto in a second, who've put their hands up and willing to talk tonight. But that link will take you to the sign up page for the next meetup, and you'll get the updated details as we go live.
This is something that we've been experimenting with, and actually I think it's landed really well. Our WhatsApp community around speakers, conversation topics, all that stuff. Thank you to those that have contributed to it, started conversations and things like that. Please join the community if you haven't already. The QR code's there. And we're going to try and put a bit more around announcements and things like that. A lot of it's been around who's free to speak. but yeah, it'd be good to kind of get a bit more of a buzzy chat there, but maybe some kind of technical themes, bit of questions, not use it as a support forum, but, just, hey, I saw this new announcement and it looked good kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And for those of you who can't get enough of the Sussex Azure user group, me and Ryan, this is being streamed live to YouTube right now, and will be available immediately after the event. And also we did a podcast that is probably about 1.5 years out of date now. So if you fancy some legacy Azure topics, then this is the place for you.
Azure Firewall in Preview.
Azure Firewall Premium was the last episode. So that's how old that is. But please do go and check it out. And obviously, if any of you are thinking about starting podcasts or anything like that, or interested, we'll happily share experiences. And the Silicon Brighton team have got loads of experience with this as well. So if it's something that you've always gone, hey, I'd like to try that, happy to chat at any time.
But the YouTube content is, mainly the events that we've run in person, hybrid events in the last kind of year or so.
And we're going to move over that slide because I haven't updated that one. So we'll skip over that last slide because I forgot to put people on it. But we are joined tonight by Steve Goodman, who many of you will know from the user group many a times as a regular attendee, who's going to do us a talk on cost optimization and how to manage your cloud spend, which is always a hot topic, no matter how things evolve.
I get asked this every week.
Yeah, it's so popular. And then we have Jonathan talking about private endpoints and data services, which is also a very hot topic about securing your data. So that's it from us. No more talking, which is good for us.
Yep.
We'll hand now over to Steve to start on the cost optimization talk.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers. What a horrible photo of me. I look like a convict. I'll have to do some work on that, won't I? Lovely, thank you. What have you done to my clicker? Yeah, it's no longer clicking. Hold on, let's start it again. There we go. We're up and running. Good. Okay, so thanks for that. So as you said, yeah, I'm Steve, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about getting to grips with your Azure spend. I'm a pre-sales cloud solution architect and DevOps lead. Work for a company in Southampton called Meta. And as the guy said, these opinions are my own, not necessarily my company's. And in my spare time, I volunteer for the guide dogs, and I'm also a keen virtual online cyclist. And I've also brought some swag along. So if the talk's really bad, remember me for the swag. Don't remember me for the talk, please. There's some agile planning poker cards. They're not normal playing cards. They are agile planning cards, and some pens as well. Please help yourself. I don't really want to carry them all home again. Okay, so why do I care so much about this topic? Let me just catch up. So back in 2012, I signed up for a Windows Azure training day. And about a week before the event, I received the usual email from them saying, hey, you need to turn up your laptop, bring a charging cable, and also, can you just sign up for this free Azure subscription? So back then, it was all very new to me, so I kind of followed all the stuff in the email, went through, did it all, and it didn't work. So I emailed them back and said, hey, I don't appear to be able to get this to work. And so they said, don't worry about it. Just turn up. We'll sort it out on the day. So, okay. Turned up on the day and kind of explained all this again on the day. And they said, you'll be fine. Just put your credit card details in. You know, we're already using free resources. All right, okay, this is new to me. Why not? Let's rock on. So we rocked on. And we had quite a good day. And actually, the guy, I remember him clearly saying, you know, it's been really good. We've got through quite a lot of stuff. We can cover some more advanced topics. So we did. And, you know, 8 weeks later, I kind of sat at home, and we were just buying a new house at this point as well. And I had nice brown hair, expecting the birth of my second daughter. And a letter dropped through the post with Ireland written on it as the postmark. And I'm like, got a letter from Ireland. This is interesting. So I opened it. In that letter was an invoice for Azure for £330. It's like, yes, okay. All right, so I quickly logged into the portal after I reminded myself what this portal looked like. Haven't seen it for 8 weeks. And I found another bill. There was another one there for £400. And because they had to post these things out, they just took so long to get here. So there I was, owing the best part of £700 to Microsoft. So I paid up the bills, and then obviously I jumped onto the support and kind of had a bit of a whinge about it. And eventually we went backwards and forwards, and they kind of realized that, yeah, okay, it wasn't really your fault. You should have deleted your resources though. We'll give you a rebate. So eventually I got a check back for £700, and it was all good. So that's why I care. We appear to be out of sync. So the other reason now I also care as well is because the cost is partly driven by the energy consumption that these data centers are using. And the energy consumption has an environmental impact. If we look at the Alliance report that they wrote back in 2020, they found there that the ICT sector accounted for somewhere between 1.8 and 2.8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And it depends how you measure it. You can take the upper end, which includes the production of the hardware and the destruction of it as well. And they estimated that was going to increase massively by 2030. So just like the Phoenix project, I thought there's got to be a better way to this. But no. Flexera, 2022 State of Cloud report. They estimate that the average SME and large enterprise spend somewhere between 2.4 and $6 million a year. In that same report, they also found that 32% of respondents estimated, 32% of that was estimated waste by the respondents. And that was estimated. So therefore, it's clearly going to be a lot higher than that. So what can affect our costs? Number of resources provisioned, the size or the SKUs that we use, the utilization of those resources, network costs, storage costs, and the location. So what tools have we got? So over the years, I've come up with several sets of tools that we can use, and we'll go through a bit of a list of them. So bog standard one, the Azure pricing calculator. The first place I always go before trying to set stand up anything in Azure. Let's go and see how much it's going to cost me. Let's look at the different SKUs, work out the location to put it in. Azure budgets. So a good thing, once you've got all this stood up, you set up your budgets on your subscriptions. You can also set up forecasting, and then you can have alerts come out of that. But better still, put them in the management groups. So you can have one at the top level. Otherwise, you could end up with death with 1,000 paper cuts with all your subscriptions all billing in. You can turn on the anomaly detection now in the Azure portal. You've got the Azure Advisor. So the advisor can give you things like cost optimization advice. And they've just released a new cost optimization workbook. Reservations, savings plans and spot instances. Again, more ways to save money. You can reserve the instances up front. You can set up a savings plan over 1 or 3 years, or you can start to use VMs at times when no one else is using them and bring your own licenses. So again, you've already paid for the licenses once. Don't go and pay for the licenses again inside of Azure. Engage in an ISV program. So this is one of the things that we did last year. We engaged in the ISV success program. We got, I think it was about $5,000 worth of credit to use over 6 months. It also came with about 10 free vouchers to use for Azure exams, as well as some various other licenses as well. So it's a program for independent service software vendors. Yeah. Just literally Google ISV success program and you'll find it on the Microsoft site. They slightly changed it now. There's different categories. I think now you have to kind of agree that you'll get something into the marketplace, and they'll give you one set of licenses. You get some with transactional support into the Azure marketplace, you'll get a different set of qualifications. So as well as that, your Microsoft Partner ID. So now kind of the gold and silver partnerships seem to be disappearing now from Microsoft, and they now have these new partner programs where you need to be able to basically show that your product's contributing so much spend to Microsoft. So if you start putting your partner ID into your Azure resource groups or into your subscriptions, Microsoft can then start to see that build up. You can also put it into your customers as well, register with them, and again, it all ticks up on a Microsoft dashboard, and they can start to see how much spend you got, and obviously in return for that, they'll then start to give you free licenses, more free credit, etc., etc. Another good one, the Azure policy. You can start to write yourself policies, so you can say, I don't want to have these particular VMs with these GPUs in them. I only want to be able to use the low-cost VMs, or I only want to have certain resources in North Europe. Tagging, multiple uses for tagging, and we'll touch upon those in a minute. There's things like being able to tag up the resources so you can see them come through on your bills, so you can build them back to the right cost centers. We'll start to see some more funky stuff we can do with decommissioning resources and auto startup and shutdown of various environments as well in a bit. Dev test subscriptions, one that often gets overlooked in my experience. These are, it's an option. You can go into the portal and you can flip your subscription over and basically say it's going to be a dev test subscription. In return for that, you're not allowed to use it for production workloads, but Microsoft will give you about a third off the cost again. It's ever so easy to do. I've got a bit of a demo of that a little bit later I can show. When we finished on the ISV success program, we actually flipped back to a bog standard subscription, and it took me a couple of weeks to realize that our bills were so high, and so I had to go back in and flip it back again, and suddenly we had a third off of our costs. Azure deployment environments, I think these have gone GA now. Yep, they got announced, was it Ignite last year, and then kind of build, they went GA at roughly. So these are where your platform engineers can basically stand up lots of infrastructure, and then your devs can come in and self-serve. And we've got a bit of an example of these a little bit later in the slides, and you can get them to automatically shut down the environments. And I think there's some plans as well to have the SKUs be able to reduce down later in the evening to lower cost SKUs and at weekends as well. Another useful one is the Azure Cost Estimator tool. We'll see a little example of this running in a minute. And if you've got external systems that you can suck all this data into, you can also export all the data out for external analysis. We'll have a look at that as well. And the last one on the tools is some PowerShell rules that can review your infrastructure for cost optimization. Okay, so moving on from the tools, some of these are techniques that I've used with the teams over the years. Be transparent about the cost. Don't try and hide the cost away. Let the developers actually know how much your service bus premium tier is costing you versus your standard one. I always use that as my example because the premium one's 560 odd quid and a standard one's about a tenner. So there's quite a difference between the two. Rewrite to make use of cloud native technologies. You know, you might have apps running on VMs which are costing you an absolute arm and a leg to run on. Rewrite it, run it in a web app or in a container. Or again, going back to the service bus example, question why is someone using the premium service bus when they could actually be using the standard? It could just well be that, well, we thought that was what we needed. But then you start to realize you're not making use of all the good stuff that the premium brings with it. Tagging again, auto stop-start tags, decommission tags. We'll look at those in a bit more detail in a minute. Right sizing of resources. Don't over provision your resources. Try and get them the right size in the first place, or resize them. Shop around for regions to use for dev environments, and we'll look at an example of this in a minute. Not all locations are equal. This was a bit of a proof of concept I put in for somebody. They were a little bit nervous about having all this stuff stood up in the cloud, and they wanted it all to shut down if it just became too expensive. So you can use various different tools. I've got an example of a logic app a bit later that will run through and shut down things when the budget exceeds it. Your BCDR, so your business continuity disaster recovery. Have a chat with the business. Review the RTO and the RPO. You know, chances are the recovery time objective and the recovery point objective, they might have told you one thing, and when you start to tell them how much it's going to cost and being transparent again about the cost, they might suddenly come up with a whole different set of figures for you. And the last one, chaos engineering and load testing. So it's great. You've stood up all this stuff in the cloud. You put in all these rules to auto scale. Try running a load test through it or running the chaos engineering through it. You'll probably find all your stuff absolutely stands up. But does it fall back down again and go back to only a couple of instances? Your load testing, for instance, could actually find bugs in your code that just ends up using more and more CPU, which spawns more and more services, which just keeps spawning more and more services. So again, using those kind of techniques is another way of just trying to iron out any issues in your system. Just quickly, there's a couple of third-party tools here that you can use if you're multi-cloud and want to kind of bring all your costs together. So let's now have a little bit of a deeper dive into some of those that I've just covered. This one's all about being transparent. I like to measure things in pizzas. Everyone likes pizza. And so one of the things I often say to the team is, that resource you've just stood up, that service bus, in fact, that premium one you've just stood up, that's going to cost you 20 pizzas a month. Do you really need it? Could we just get away with a standard one for £10 a month? And then one of the things I try and do is every couple of months, get some pizzas in at lunchtime, and make people actually think, what, we've just saved the money, so why don't we have the pizzas? And it's kind of based off of the Big Mac index, which is an informal way of measuring purchase power parity between two currencies. So you kind of look at the price of a Big Mac in different places in the world, and you can work out what your spending power is. But it's the same thing. I just use Domino's pizzas. The Azure pricing calculator. So go in, add all your resources in, tweak all the little bits of it, pick your tiers and your SKUs, pick your locations. It'll give you a price at the end of it. It's a price. It's an estimate. It's good. It's a working place to have a conversation with. It won't necessarily be spot on. There'll be lots of different things that will change, lots of things that you'll miss. But it gives you some idea of where you are and what kind of money you'll be looking to spend. Location, location, location. So here we've got an application gateway with a WAF to V2 firewall. This particular one is in the East US, and no, you can't see my point. Oh, can you see my pointer? No, it's going to cost us £208 a month. Yeah, take exactly the same thing. We now move it into Sweden South, and it's going to cost you £352. And obviously, you can't necessarily do this in a production environment. You can't pick and choose where you put your resources. But in a development environment, does it matter? Can you get away with putting it in certain locations that are cheaper? And the reason for this cost difference is because Sweden South is a much more modern place, and they use a lot more environmentally friendly energy generation. So you pay more for it. Another one, look at using ARM CPUs over x86 CPUs. The claim is there's about a 50% saving in energy and cost. I couldn't quite find it when I looked through the pricing calculator, but it certainly was a cost saving when you're doing it. Now, a lot of the modern tools will all run on ARM CPUs. So the Azure budgets and forecasts and alert. So you go into the portal, you go find your budgets, click on add, and then start creating your budget. So it gives you some kind of idea there on the right-hand side, roughly what you spent in the last month. So on this particular example, we spent £49 in the last month. At some point, we did manage to spend £203, and therefore it's decided that my monthly forecast must be £213. I'm not quite sure how it works out that. And it also seems to think we're going to grow in a linear fashion as well over the next few months. But hopefully you'd have some idea of kind of what your budget is. So you can put your budget amount in at the bottom. You can set up your creation date, expiry date, and then you can go in and start to set up some alerts. So you can say, I want to receive an alert when I hit 90% or 100% of my budget. But also then I introduce forecasting, and forecasting is great. So whereas a budget will tell you when you've gone over your spend, the forecast will actually tell you that I forecast you're going to go over your spend. And so it can tell you a lot earlier in the process. Again, you can get these then to run through action groups. So you can set up various different action groups. You can set it up to send out emails. You can have it send emails to the owners, the contributors, the readers, etc. inside of the subscription. And you can also get it to run actions, and you can get it to run automation runbooks and logic apps. And we'll come back to that a bit later. And so once you set all this up, you then receive your forecast emails. They come out, they kind of tell you where you are, they give you the date they were generated on, they tell you when the budget started, and they kind of tell you that looks like this one here tells them I'm going to go 12p over my budget. But it's told me nice and early into the process so I can do something about it. As opposed to the budget alerts, which just tell you when you have gone over it or when you're within 90% of it, but you've actually committed and spent that money at that point. And like all good things in Azure, you can stand these up through using Bicep or ARM templates. There's an example here of using the Bicep templates. At the top, you've got your action group. And then down there at the bottom, you've got your budget, which also relates then into your action group. And you can see then that the contact groups down the bottom uses the action group above. And then back in the portal, you can start to see stuff in your cost analysis. You can get a trajectory of your spend. You can see when you're going to go over the budget. So on this particular one, I can see that towards the end of the month, I'm going to go over my budget. And you can then start to dive down and look at some more details on it as well. There's also now an AI-powered functionality in the cost management, just like everything else. Microsoft are on this AI bandwagon. You can probably got a chat GPT bit on the side now that you can start to have conversations with it. I think it's in private preview or somewhere. Yeah, it's in that area. It's coming soon. So yeah, now you can start asking questions about your budget spend to it. The anomaly detection, again, similar to adding a budget, but this time you can just add an anomaly alert. Much more simpler UI for this one. And this will look for anomalies in your spend. My experience, it's not great. If you end up deleting a resource group, it suddenly goes off and triggers. Maybe that's what you're after. But equally, if someone's come in and added a whole load of resources in there, the thing goes off as well, and that does work. So it's better on adding resources, not so good on the deleting of them. So the cost exporter for external analysis. This is a tool in the cost management. You can go into the cost management. You can click on the exports. And you click on add. And then you start to fill in some details for it. You give it a name. You give it an export type. So this particular example here, we're doing a daily export of month-to-date costs. I say when I want it to start. I can then pick a storage account down the bottom. So this will push out to a storage account, a CSV file. So I'm picking my storage account now. And then I can pick the container and the directory. And eventually you get down, you hit create, and you end up waiting about a minute, maybe 2 minutes. And eventually you'll end up on a screen that looks a bit like this one. And then from here, once it's all scheduled, you can then get it to generate your CSV files. You can then have a whole lot of other tools that then consume these CSV files. So you might want to bring them into Power BI or to Tableau or to some other external system that you use for your reporting. Yeah, I meant to give you credit actually because it was your LinkedIn post that pointed me in this direction. So cheers. So the cost optimization workbooks, again, back in the portal, drop into the Azure Advisor, go into the workbooks and click on the cost optimization preview one. And you can then start to click along the tabs and it gives you some indication of certain optimizations you could make. I don't have particularly any VMs in my environment. But I do have some storage accounts. And rather interestingly, there is recommending that I upgrade the Cloud Shell storage account to a V2 storage account, even though it was automatically generated for me. So this one came about from a conference I was at last week, actually. I went to DevOps Days London last week, and someone posed this question, and it was interesting because actually a couple of weeks ago, I also had this similar thought. So in one of our dev environments, we have an Azure, we have a SQL Server running with the full audit turned on, and it's pumping out data left, right, and center. We're now about 90 days into that, and it's generated over 100 gig of data. It's costing me about £22 a month for this thing to pump out this data, and just for us to store it in the storage account. And someone posted these particular facts. up to 30% of your total cloud spend can be attributed to observability. And I was like, yep, definitely. 99% of it is indexed but never searched. Yep, haven't looked in it. Certainly don't go past the last 7 days. And if you go and delete 30% of the data today, I wouldn't notice. So, do you need it? Do you need it turned on? I'll leave you to take away that and think about it. The pay-as-you-go dev test subscription. So, back into the subscription, hit the switch offer, pick the pay-as-you-go dev test one, and hit switch offer, and off you go. Next up, Azure Cost Estimator. And this is basically an executable you can run from the console. You point it at a bicep script or an ARM script, and off it goes, and it will run, and it will tell you basically how much that will cost to run. So it gives you the price out at the end of it. Now, the nice thing with this is you can plug this into your pipeline, because you can also pass another parameter in of your budget. So you can actually get your pipelines to stop if this is going to go over your budget. Moving on into the tagging world. This is one that I've used quite heavily before in the past. So these are tags that we can apply to things like VMs, or we can apply them to Azure container instances. We basically have an automation runbook that runs on a schedule. You set up the schedules. You can have lots of different schedules to run. You then pass in the particular action that you want to do. You want to start up or shut down, and then you pass in the tag value. When that time's met, the script executes, and it will then start up or shut down your various VMs. And the nice thing about this is you can have lots of different values in your tag. So you can have early mornings. This was a job we wanted to run very early in the morning. We wanted it to start up for 6 a.m. and then we wanted it to finish again by 6:30 and bring the VM back down. But other times we've used it, we had it come on at 8 o'clock in the morning. We have a job run. It brings up the build environments for the team and then takes them back down again at the end of the day. So I need to give credit to this one. This one came from a guy called Marcel Lupo, who wrote an excellent blog post, and there's also a very good YouTube video as well. And he had this idea of using tags for decommissioning. And so I thought that was great. You put some tags on it. You have an Azure function that runs in the background on a cron job. So we have it run just after midnight every night. And it basically loops through all your resources, all your resource groups. It will work at either level. And it will find the date. And if the date is in the past, it will go ahead and just delete the resources. Obviously, if you don't want it to delete the resources, you can put locks on the resources, or you can go in and change the date. So I took it a bit of a step further. So because of that reason, and you're laughing, I also slightly changed it as well, and I started to add alerts in there as well. So now you get a 7-day countdown as well before it goes and deletes it, and it uses a Logic app then to email out and telling people they're going to go. And people said that was great, but what happens if I don't want to delete it? I just want to be reminded it's there. So we took it, kind of spun it around a little bit, and then we came up with a review date tag. Exactly the same thing happens. When the date's met, you get an email to say, hey, go and review this this resource or this resource group. And you'll keep getting an email every day until you go and change the date on it or you go and delete it. I haven't used this one myself, but I did come across it whilst doing some research for this. It's basically a PowerShell script, which does a very similar thing to what we've just seen with the tagging. It runs through the console, and it basically ends up applying several tags onto your resources. So you have things like subject for deletion, and it says this is suspected. It can also have rejected in there as well if you don't want it to actually delete it. But the idea is if it's suspected and then the next time it runs, it still finds that that tag's there, it will actually go away and it will delete the resource on the next run. So it's doing a very similar thing to the decommission tags. So yeah, this was the Logic app that I mentioned earlier. We had some nervous people who basically wanted things shut down if the spend became very high. So we set up an action group based off of our budgets, and we just got it to call this particular Logic app, and it went through and it shut down a load of resources. So So the Azure deployment environments touched upon earlier, these are now GA. These allow your dev infrastructure teams to stand up a load of infrastructure and set up all the templates, and then your developers can come into the portal or CLI, and they can start to run those templates and stand up their own environments and be self-service. And you can plug them into your pipelines as well. One of the nice things that these bring is the auto expiry and the ability at a later date to be able to change the SKUs, lower the SKUs at night, lower them over the weekend. I'm not sure though quite what the use of that is. If you run this in the way I'd envisage it, you'd have these things stood up in the morning and teared down again at night, and you just keep rebuilding them every day. So you don't really need to go change your SKUs in your dev environments. Maybe you would in certain other environments. Okay, so this all now kind of falls under the umbrella of FinOps. And it goes under various different names there that are scrolling across the screen. But the idea of FinOps is it's the financial management, discipline, and cultural practice that enables organizations to get maximum business value by helping engineers, finance, technology, and business teams to collaborate on a data-driven spending decisions. And there's a whole website there, the FinOps Foundation, and there's loads of stuff on there. They've got whole loads of presentations, maturity models as well. It's well worth having a read of it. And whilst we're on the ops bandwagon, there's green ops. Exactly the same thing, but this one's more around minimizing the environmental impact. So some things to take away. There's a free ebook that Microsoft have published. And this is Marcel's Lupo's blog post. And what I'll do is I'll make the slides available on my LinkedIn. I should have said that earlier, sorry. So you can grab all of these QR codes off of there. And there's also a link there to, this is actually to a repo that I've got on my GitHub, but I forked it from somewhere else, and I'm just waiting for them to accept the pull request back into there. So I will carry on giving them credit for it. As soon as the pull request's gone, I will pull my details off of this. But yeah, there's a really good list of resources in there. Thank you. Any questions?
Good. Which mic? Does it matter? No. So you had a list of points there about different tools and techniques that you can do to sort of help manage your costs, etc. One of the things that I didn't see that I wasn't sure if you missed out on purpose was what your view is on effective RBAC on your resource groups and all your subscriptions. Because if you sort of cut the cord at the root and that person hasn't got permission in the first place to deploy any of that, that sort of gets you around. Because I worked with a customer recently and he said, oh, I don't want high costs. And I said, well, we'll just put policies in over your subscription. And he was like, no, I don't want them to have the permissions in the first place. So then I had to start, coming up with a real granular RBAC model across their whole platform, which was a bit of a pain. So I just wanted your thoughts on whether you think that's a good.
Yeah, so I guess I come from an organization that's quite open. And one of the things is we're transparent with our costs. So we kind of give our developers quite a lot of freedom to do their own thing. However, we do have a lot of pipelines now that will stand up a lot of environments for developers. So we do actually have subscriptions where they just don't have access to it. They can run the pipeline in Azure DevOps, stand up all the infrastructure, deploys the application into it, and that's it, job done. So yeah, absolutely. I think it is another one of the approaches that you could go down and literally lock the subscription down, and the only thing that has access to it is your pipelines. Yeah. And that'll work reasonably well.
Any other questions? Cool. I think round of applause for Steve. And thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
I think we'll have a 3-4 minute break, and then we'll, toilet break, grab a drink, and then we'll head on for Jonathan's talk. Cool. Thank you. Cool, thanks everyone.
Oh, we got we're good. Your speakers are dead.
Thanks everyone. So yeah, part 2 to the evening. Jonathan's going to talk to us about Azure Private Link.
I also think there's some infrastructure as code somewhere buried in here, right? Yeah. So if any of you are in your infrastructure as code space, look out. Terraform or Bicep? Well, Bicep all the way. Okay, he's given away the secrets early. So there you go. Enjoy.
Everyone give us a round of applause for Jonathan. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, that's quite loud. I don't think I need the mic. Yeah? Okay. All right. I'll keep the mic. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the session today on securing your data using Azure Private Link. The objective of my talk today is not to convince you to go and start slapping private endpoints across all of your infrastructure, but really to give you some of the battle scars that I've had through some of the projects that I'm working on in the implementation of private endpoints, and actually just sort of let you think a little bit about whether you actually probably need them across your estate. So a little bit about me. So I work for an organization called Adatis, who are a Microsoft data and AI partner. I've been with Adatis for just over 5 years now, working with the Azure BI stack. I started my career in the managed services arm of the business, where I was actually supporting and maintaining the data platforms. But actually, in the more recent years, I've moved into a more infrastructure and DevOps style role, where actually I operate the platforms in via infrastructure as code. Originally starting with ARM templates, but actually in the more recent years, moving on to Terraform and Bicep. Sorry, Microsoft ARM templates were a big headache. Yeah. And then it was actually, how do we push our infrastructure into sort of a DevOps lifecycle? So then it was actually using CI/CD pipelines such as DevOps pipelines and GitHub Actions to do that. So for the agenda for today, before we actually get into the realms of private endpoints, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what a public endpoint is, as that will actually transition us in quite nicely into talking about private endpoints. And then we'll talk about the considerations that actually need to be taken into account when implementing private endpoints. And then we'll also talk very briefly about what the difference between a private endpoint and a service endpoint is, as there's actually quite a lot of ambiguity around that and a bit of confusion. So we'll just sort of iron that out. And then hopefully we'll do a demo where I'll sort of demonstrate private endpoints in action and how you can actually use them to lock down your PaaS services. And then I'll actually show you as well actually how you can configure your private endpoints in infrastructure as code. And then we'll have a time for questions at the end. So what is a public endpoint? So my definition of a public endpoint is that it's the native entry point for users to access or connect to most services within Azure. So what does that mean? So that means actually that my PaaS services is accessible over the internet. So if I provision my Key Vault or my storage account or whatever PaaS service I might provision, I can contact that service over the public internet. And it's the default network configuration for Azure PaaS services where they're assigned a public IP within the Azure space. It's suitable for those resources that I don't actually want to have a network perimeter around, so maybe certain applications that I want available over the internet and for people to connect to those quite freely. The public endpoint really fits this purpose quite well. But it doesn't always mean that it's open to the whole wide world. So actually I can toggle the service firewall on that PaaS resource. So I can actually limit which IP addresses can contact that. I can deploy what we call a service endpoint. So I can say actually it's only accessible from within a specific subnet on a virtual network. And it also means that actually I still require authentication to that service. So even with a public endpoint doesn't mean that anyone can just access a Key Vault or a storage account. They need some level of authentication to get to that service. However, it is the most simplified way of integrating resources within Azure, because it means that those services can actually contact quite freely over those endpoints. And this is where private endpoints come in. So where public endpoints might seem great and allow me to access my resources quite freely, that probably won't meet the requirements of a lot of security and DevSecOps teams. And I've definitely found that from my own personal experience. And so by Microsoft's definition, a private endpoint is a network interface that uses a private IP address from within your virtual network. So this now means that actually when I deploy a private endpoint to my resource and I lock off the public endpoint, I'm no longer able to contact that service now over the public internet. Each service is assigned a private IP address from within the virtual network subnet that you actually associate your private endpoint to. And it's really suitable for those resources that you want to restrict network access. So I don't want my particular application available on the World Wide Web. I want actually that to be only accessible from within my corporate network. And it's really great for those applications that you want to bring within your company's corporate network. So when you apply private endpoints to your resources, you can actually make those somewhat an extension of your on-prem network, so that actually you can apply those normal firewall rules and routing that you would do if it was a normal network. Having said that, it can add a big layer of complexity to your solutions. So whereas previously over the public endpoint, your services could connect to those resources, well, actually now if that public endpoint is now locked off, you actually now need to start thinking about other ways about how your resources are going to communicate with that. And I'll cover off some of those points later on in the presentation. Is it overkill? Well, that really depends on the sort of information and that you're storing within your platform. If you find that actually you're not really storing confidential data within your storage account and it's pretty transparent data that doesn't really need to be secured, then perhaps private endpoints really aren't the way to go. So if I did want to go down that private endpoint route, what are some of the components actually that I now need to start thinking about if I want to implement this? I need to start thinking about virtual networks. Previously, if I was deploying a storage account with just a public endpoint, I wouldn't really need to worry about implementing virtual networks. But if I want to go down that private endpoint route, well, I need to deploy a virtual network to associate my private endpoint to. I need to start thinking about private DNS zones. So where previously the public IP address was resolvable through the Azure DNS, I need to now start thinking about integrating private DNS zones to make sure that that private IP address in our subnet is now able to resolve by a name. I might want to start thinking about network security groups, so I can actually sort of restrict traffic from within my subnets and apply different security rules. I might want to start thinking about route tables, so I can route some of the traffic via the firewall and determine where that next hop might be. And I might also want to start thinking about, do I need to start integrating Azure Firewall into the mix as well? And then quite importantly as well, and this is what a lot of customers that I work with seem to forget about, is that actually they want to go down the private endpoint route. They obviously see a lot of the Microsoft security recommendation advisors that say your Key Vault needs a private endpoint or your storage account. But then actually, how do I now connect to that resource? So I need to start thinking about, do I need ExpressRoute? Do I need site-to-site VPN? Or am I going to use a cloud-native solution such as Azure DevBoxes or AVD to actually connect to that resource that's behind a private endpoint? And a really simplified architecture of how this might look in the real world is at the bottom, you might have your hub VNet, where you might have your gateway and your Azure Firewall. And as we can see, paired off that, we have our spoke network, where we will have our storage accounts and our key vaults. And as we can see that those resources are deployed into virtual networks, utilizing the DNS from within the hub to be able to resolve that. And as we can see, actually, that our storage account is deployed into a particular subnet. So as we've there for our storage account, we've got 10.0.1.32/27. When we deploy that private endpoint, a private IP address from within that space will be associated to that resource. So how does this differ from a service endpoint? Well, a service endpoint remains a publicly routable IP address, but effectively all we're saying is actually you can only contact that public endpoint from within that specific virtual network. So how does this make me more secure? Well, I now have that private connectivity. So this means that we can only allow communication from within our VNet or from within a specific peered VNet. Traffic now flows over the Microsoft backbone, reducing that exposure to threats that might be there with the public endpoint. Public internet isolation, so no longer directly accessible over the public internet. That therefore reduces the attack vector for potential hackers. And network security. So actually now with private endpoints, we can actually start to leverage NSGs and firewalls to actually dictate which services can contact that resource. And data privacy. So by ensuring data remains within your private network, you can ensure that that data isn't traveling anywhere near the public internet. And monitoring and logging, and this is another key one. You can actually monitor and log the traffic that's going to your private endpoints, which might actually give you some insights on what's happening there. Demo. So there's a few things actually that I want to cover off in this demo. Firstly, I'm going to show you by using Azure Policy, you can actually enforce your infrastructure to be deployed with private network access. So ensuring that people can't deploy their storage accounts with public endpoints. I'm also then going to show you actually how you can toggle the service firewall on your particular PaaS resource to actually dictate, actually, I only want to access this resource from a particular network. And then I'm going to show you actually how you can configure a private endpoint through the portal and then actually transition that into a much more scalable solution via infrastructure as code. Right, let's hope I get this right. Yeah, do you know what? That would be really helpful, actually. Ooh. Testing. Good? Perfect. So if by our standards, I'm actually going to want to govern exactly dictating to people that I don't want them deploying their services with public endpoints, I can do this via Azure Policy. So if we go to my policies that I've got here, and we go to my assignments, you can see I've got one here for deny the public endpoint for the storage account. I've got two storage accounts, one's compliant, one's not. This one was obviously deployed before I assigned the policy. But if I go view to the assignment, if I view the definition of that, we can see actually we've got some metadata here. So it's a JSON policy, it's just a JSON file with some metadata initially there. And as we can see that we've set our effect to deny. So we can deny storage accounts that don't meet the requirement of setting the public network access property within their infrastructure as code to disabled. So that means that unless that property is set to disabled, that's not going to be allowed into the Azure subscription. So if I go to my very basic storage account that I've done here, if I set this to public network access enabled, and I go to try and deploy that, we can see we've got an error message here. And that's saying that actually that this was disallowed by the policy, and the reason is that this storage account has the public access, public endpoint enabled. This is not allowed. So if I set that to disabled, we can see our deployment started. hopefully that will return back that that has succeeded. Go to the portal might be quicker. Cool, and as we can see, our public storage has now succeeded. And we now have our storage account that's deployed. And if we try and get into that, don't have any containers. Create. And if I try and get into that, I can't get into that because the public endpoint is disabled. So let's say actually people try and think, well, you know what, I'm just going to deploy it with the public endpoint disabled, but then when it's actually deployed, I'll just click enable and happy days. Well, they'll get stopped from doing that as well. So if I wanted to deploy a service endpoint to this resource, which means that I'm still using that same publicly routable IP address, but I'm saying I only want to contact that from a certain virtual network, I can say add existing virtual network, select my virtual network, and then it will give me a range of subnets that are within my VNet, but it will tell me here that the service endpoint is required. So I can click on that and hit add, and it will deploy the service endpoint, or actually I can go into my virtual network. If I go to subnets, I can delegate, I can add a service endpoint for that. If I type in storage, you've got Microsoft.storage. But that's still not using private endpoint technology, okay? That's still saying that I'm still using the public endpoint, but I want to use the only access it from a certain IP address or certain network. So if I wanted to associate a private endpoint to this resource through the portal, I could go to private endpoint connections, and I can go to add private endpoint, and I can call this PEP test. And as you can see, it's deploying a network interface for us here. And that's actually what's the magic that's happening under the hood. That's what's being associated with the virtual network. You need to make sure it's in the same region as your virtual network. And I hit click next. And then I can select my different sub-resource type. So for different resources, they may have multiple target sub-resource types like storage. So there's a different endpoint for blob, there's a different one for table, and there's a different one for queue, file, web, and DFS if you're using data lake storage. So if I wanted to create a blob endpoint for my private endpoint, I can see now that I need to associate my private endpoint with the virtual network. So I can either say I want to dynamically allocate the IP address or I want that to be static. Doesn't really matter too much when you're using DNS because it will all resolve by the name anyway. So I select my virtual network and then I select which subnet I want that to be associated with. So I can say I want that to just go in my spare one. So DNS, which is your question that you had here. So I already have pre-canned a private DNS zone. It wasn't going to demo this, but I'll show you actually how you can create your private DNS zone. If I hit next, you can hit review. I can hit create. We can now simply just add a private endpoint. Now this is great for demo purposes, but in the real world, when our platforms have got 20 private endpoints doing this through the portal, it's not really a scalable solution, and it's not great as well for when you need to transition through to the various environments. So we typically need to do this via infrastructure as code. So while that's loading, I've created a private DNS zone here called privatelink.blob.core.windows.net. So Microsoft give you the list of DNS zones that you need to create or that are associated with certain private endpoints, okay? So if you want to create a private endpoint for your blob storage and you want that to be targeted at your blob endpoint, you need to create a private DNS zone called privatelink.blob.core.windows.net. And you can do that by going to private DNS. You can go to private DNS zones, you can hit create, select which resource group you want that to go into, and then you give it a name. So you need to know what name to give this, but all the docs provide you with that information. So if we wanted to do one for table or something, we could do private link table windows.net. That's it. Go to next tags. You can tag that. You can create that. And then that will create your private DNS zone. So then once that's created, you can associate your private endpoint. Now, generally in the architecture that your private DNS zones are located somewhere centrally so that all your workloads can use those. They're not really, you don't set up typically private DNS zones for your specific workloads. They're located in a central location so that all the workloads can utilize them.
So just a comment. So the reality is it just gives you a nice environment to mimic. Oh, sorry. It gives you a nice environment to mimic true DNS usage.
Yeah,
In
exactly.
a private way, instead of having to go out to the public
Exactly.
and test it and do your things there.
Gives you a nice integrated way for resolving your private endpoints. It means you don't necessarily start setting up domain controllers or anything like this. It's a real easy way to resolve DNS within Azure.
Nice. That's nice. Yeah, thank you.
That's okay.
A handy call out for Azure Files, and if you are using things like your own DNS, just remember you're going to be resolving that domain for like core.windows.net, and so will anyone else that's using those DNS servers. So if you've got people that are using different Azure tenancies or trying to resolve different things or access different file servers or Azure files that you didn't spin up, you may find that they start trying to resolve private
link.
Private link or whatever, theirs could be like thatchersgold.core.windows.net, and theirs won't resolve. Another one to kind of call out as well. So if you're doing like any sort of DNS layer security, you'll kind of run into having to add that as your own private DNS as a zone that you control. Yeah.
I'm not sure if John's going to cover this, but do you want to cover why the names have to be specific and why you can't call this my.table.windows.net?
Go ahead, Jack.
Fine. So, fair enough. So the reason the names are predefined for PaaS services is because the way that Private Link actually works is it does a DNS hack. So you always go to the publicly available DNS namespace. You always go to mystorageaccount.table.windows.net, right? You always go to the public endpoint as if nothing's changed. But when you're in a network that has a private endpoint available, what actually happens is there's a CNAME that happens and it tries to go to private link dot first. If it can't find that, you'll then get if you can't find a name server or a zone that resolves that DNS namespace, you'll just get the public IP address responded to you. Yeah. So when you're outside, that's the way that Private Link actually works, which is why DNS is the most important part of Private Link ever. And also the part that causes the most headaches and we see go wrong the most because, you can't give it a custom DNS name. You can't have your own A record. You have to follow for PaaS services, storage, key vaults, AKS, any Microsoft PaaS service, you have to use the DNS zone that we specify. And that's why, to Jonathan's point, you have to try and centralize these where possible, because if you've got 15 app teams all creating their own DNS zones, it's chaos. It's utter chaos. There's some great guidance written by the team that in Azure landing zones about how to centralize these and how to do this all via policy, like John's showing. So go and check that out if you're looking for guidance on how to centralize that. But that's why DNS is super important with Private Link.
And the other thing we always find out that catches people out. So actually, this is all great from when you're in Azure. But what about when you're on-prem and you want to resolve those from on-prem? You have to set up those conditional forwarders to forward those DNS requests from on-prem. So from the client who's on their on-prem network, they go to their DNS server that's on-prem, and there'll be conditional forwarders set up to forward those requests to the DNS service in Azure, whether that be you have domain controllers or the private DNS resolver or AADS, to resolve that for you. So you need to set up those conditional forwarders if you want to resolve those private endpoints from on-prem.
And I think that's a really key point as well, is that you can't resolve a private DNS zone outside of Azure. So if the private DNS zone service has a 168, it uses one of our multicast addresses. You can't resolve that over an express route or a VPN directly. If you targeted that, it'll be like, who are you? Like, don't respond to that. So you need a VM or something within a virtual network that is associated with that private DNS zone to be able to resolve it. DNS control, domain controllers, ADDS, or private DNS resolver.
Yeah, that's really worked really well, actually, the private DNS resolver. There's a PaaS service, and you can create an inbound or an outbound endpoint. So if you create an inbound endpoint on your private DNS resolver, and you've got a site-to-site VPN or express route, on that inbound endpoint, it generates an IP address from within your virtual network, and you forward your DNS requests up to that private DNS resolver, and it will resolve your private endpoints. Cool. DNS, as Jack said, is the biggest pain point when it comes to private endpoints. It's almost always my first prerequisite when going in with a client. Do you have DNS set up? They tell me yes all the time. It's never set up. Cool. Right. Where was I? Okay. So, right. I have to get my trail of thought now. So I've showed you how to deploy that through the portal. Now, if I wanted to do that via infrastructure as code, it's pretty simple. So I've created this module here where I've got my main.biceps, all those resources that you saw that were in that resource group. They're all deployed via this module. If you want access to this to get started, then I'm more than happy to share that with you. And as we can see, I'm deploying my virtual network and then my subnets. Played around with the subnet function that's recently released. Brilliant. Yeah, working out the ranges, especially when you're using different CIDR ranges, trying to get the starting them.
This is where non-networking folk who start playing with networking become exposed.
Yeah.
Because they're like, what do you mean it starts at 0? Like, what do you mean like that's the first usable address? So yeah, like these new functions are available in ARM and Bicep, but help you, especially when you're doing it dynamic like IP addressing and you don't know what it's going to be. Before, you'd have to do some random guesswork and some maths in a variable, but now there's actually a CIDR function that it will return the first usable address. So I think in this case, what are you doing here, John? Like you're saying, whatever the VNet address prefix is, give me a /27 out of that, and you're doing it in a loop by the looks of it?
Yeah, so I'm saying give me 3 /27s.
Fine, so yeah, nice. So John doesn't have to work out the maths for that anymore.
No.
Let the platform do it.
And I used this on a customer recently, and it was great because going from one environment to the next, it was pain. I only had to supply the VNet address space, did the rest for you. So yeah, so I'm saying to the in the infrastructure as code, give me 3 /27s, and then I'm passing the names into an array as well. So obviously for every subnet, I need a name for that as well.
So is that interest? Could you have counted the number of names there? 1, 2, 3. Use that as an index for this one.
Yeah, you can do. Yeah, so you can say for iron list, and then you could and then I'm creating my private DNS zone module here. So in my storage account template that I've got here, so I've got my storage account resource here. So I'm saying I want my storage account, and then I want my data lake container. And actually baked into this module, you can actually deploy your private endpoint. So there's a couple of ways to do this, and I've done it on different ways. You can either have a module, private endpoint module, which you can call for every resource that you want, or actually you can bake the private endpoint within the actual module of that resource itself, enforcing users that if they're using your infrastructure as code, that they've got to deploy a private endpoint as part of that resource. So as we can see here, we're giving our private endpoint a name. I always like doing PE, the sub-resource type, and then the name of the storage account, so you can easily identify which resource that private endpoint is associated with. And as we can see, importantly, we're associating our private endpoint with a subnet. So as we can see, we've got our subnet ID. I'm just using the resource ID function to pull out the subnet information there. So we're associating our private endpoint with that subnet. And then down below here, we're just actually associating our private endpoint with our storage account. So we can see what our private link service ID, and then we're just associating that there. And then I'm saying my group ID. So for example, this one's DFS. If I needed to deploy a blob private endpoint, I would change that to blob, as I've done here. And then if it was table, it would be table, etc. And as we can see here, we can also configure our linkage to the private DNS zone as well here. So we've got our private DNS zone group here, and we're associating our private endpoint with that DNS zone. Any questions about that or how that's configured?
Private DNS zone groups. Sorry, the voice from the deep just speaks. The private DNS zone groups. Why would you use a private DNS zone group over just creating an A record, for example? Like, have you? Like, obviously, the key challenge is if you were to use an A record, you've constantly got to update that if something changes, right? So, do zone groups help in that point?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously automatically registers the resource straight into your private DNS zone, so you don't need to worry about that. So when you create the zone group and you associate your private endpoint or you associate that private DNS zone group to your private endpoint, automatically adds that record into.
And most importantly, cleans it up, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. Deletes afterwards.
We've seen so many people like create a manual A records because they go, hey, yeah, we know what we're doing with DNS. We're going to create a manual A record to point to this private endpoint. And then they delete their storage account. And they're like, why have we still got an A record for this storage account that now, somebody like Bob in another department's recreated with different IP and they're getting a different result. And it's because they've not used zone groups. So tip of the day is use zone groups. They make all of the automation around private endpoint and DNS zone management easy. Just use them. Like, don't ever create them manually.
And the one thing I love about Bicep, and this will always be the winner for me, and I never get bored of seeing it, is the visualizer that it gives you. So if I open the Bicep visualizer, I get a view of my infrastructure. And all these lines actually here represent the dependencies that I've coded for within my infrastructure as code. So these aren't things that I've, added in here. And it's always impressed. And security teams and infrastructure teams that we go and work with, they love it because they can see what exactly you're deploying, and you can just sort of give them a quick glimpse of this, and they love it. And then
just a call out. Do you see your new for loops in your subnets?
Oh, good question, actually.
I do frequent with Bicep. And one of the things I've found is anything you do in a loop, it doesn't ever.
No, I can see here it hasn't.
And if there's ever one thing that I really want to change, that as well as an export function, but take as it comes. But
export the image.
Yeah, you can. There's like an export button. It's called screen grab, isn't it? Yeah.
No, screen grab's got the dots in the background. I don't want the dots.
Use darling.
Jack, where is this export function? Because I've not. Open source. No.
Jack's got some swanky version that we don't have.
I've got a hidden version. Have you raised the GitHub issue for it? Well, you don't ask, you don't get. So there you go. Log an issue on the repo, and I'm sure they'll consider it. But no, I think that has been asked before. But for loops don't generally show, as well as modules, they all show as folders. But they now have improved it to show you what's inside the module.
It's better than what Terraform gives you anyway.
Yeah, do a Terraform, like what's the diagram? You get like
graph.
the text Terraform graph, and then count your chickens, because this is much nicer. But yeah, what was the thing I was going to say about this? Have you also seen the new Bicep deployment
preview pane? Yeah, where you get the what if.
That's
I've
way nicer.
signed up. Show deployment.
Yeah. So you can now, instead of having to do it all through a CLI, you can just pick it all from here. So where John was doing it from the top, like deploy, and you also gives you the output at the bottom, so you can see like a visual representation, which is really quite slick. So
the what if didn't work great though.
We're not going to talk about what if. What if doesn't work great, full stop. But yeah, it's getting better. Yeah, it's getting better.
No, it's true.
You actually need your dependencies in your Bicep. Because if you reference them, on your main Bicep, you've got referencing like depends on storage account to be created. But if you actually reference, like you create a storage account and then you want to say shit like a private link, if you reference it, it should create the dependency.
Yeah, it should do. I'm just super cautious, and for me, best practices, I like just coding dependencies. And it helps. It helps someone who's not seen the infrastructure or doesn't know it as well actually sort of see those clear dependencies as well. So if they're reading that for the first time, if they're not really typically clued on, anyone can read depends on. So if they're coming at it for a first time, they can actually say, oh, okay, brilliant. This depends on this, or this depends on that. That's why I like it. And some of it, obviously, for example, the virtual network doesn't reference the resource group. So well, apart from in the scope, but that doesn't create, I don't think that actually creates a depend function here, because obviously this is a subscription scope deployment, which, by the way, I don't really do resource group deployments now. It's all subscription scope because you can just spin everything up from there. So yeah, has everyone here used Bicep before, or are they on Terraform? You don't like it?
Yeah, I use it a lot. It's like my day to day.
Yeah.
And we're trying to build greenfield Bicep.
Yeah. And I find also exporting current infrastructure that you've already deployed in the portal into Bicep is just so much easier than Terraform. You don't have to start faffing around importing into state or anything like that. I do like Terraform. This isn't a Terraform bash, but by the way. Yeah, I mean, it is. I do like, and it does have its purpose. And I only use it when my clients that I'm working with say, we've already invested highly in Terraform. This is the route we're going. So,
the Azure Terrafy been rebranded to the Azure Exporter tool, much more formal, which now helps you with all of that exporting from and all the import statements and stuff like that. So that's all basically gives you the same functionality as like when you go in Bicep and say, hey, copy this resource ID and dump it in a template for me, or export from a resource group, Azure Terrafy. So if you look up AZTFY or the Azure Exporter tool for Terraform, that now does the import. Like if you deployed stuff via Bicep or the portal and you want to pull that into Terraform, it will do that for you. Only at resource and subscription scope today, but they're working on the others.
Cool.
Back to Private Endpoints.
Yeah.
A lot of my customers ask me, service endpoints, private endpoints, which one should I look at? Now, obviously, one thing that we should probably call out back to Steve's talk is private endpoints cost.
Yeah.
The service endpoints don't.
It's on my follow-on slides, but yeah.
Okay, I'll let you.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to call that out really, that they are a cost resource.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a place for service endpoints if you can use them, but there are
Exactly.
drawbacks and all that kind of stuff.
So private endpoints cost around £7 per month per endpoint, which is not too bad if you've got maybe an app which has got, needs a couple of private endpoints. But typically when we're working on data platforms, when you're looking at quite a few multiple PaaS services, and a lot of those services take on more than one private endpoint, you might be looking at 20 private endpoints for your platform per environment. So you can see actually how the costs start to spiral out. And I'll touch on this more on my following slides, but actually you need to start also thinking about supporting services to support that. So once actually we've spun up our infrastructure with private endpoints, actually how do I deploy to that service now? I can't use the agents that Microsoft give me because they can't contact that. So I need to start creating virtual machine scale sets or dedicated VMs to self-hosted agents to carry out those deployments, and they all cost money as well. I'll touch a little bit more on that, but no, it's a really, really good point. Whereas service endpoints are great, and it means actually, if you've got a VM in a virtual network, you can get to that from that. But it's not an extension, whereas private endpoints are a bit more of an extension of your on-prem network, or they can be. Service endpoints aren't.
Really important thing that a lot of people overlook is private endpoints solve the problem of not having to have an express route with public peering, or Microsoft peering, which is complex to set up. You need your own private routable IPv4 address space, and then you need to go through this complicated setup process to advertise your public BGP or your public IP address space to Microsoft, and then you have to learn Microsoft's public IP address space. That's complex from a networking perspective because you might not want to do that. From an Office 365 and all those other perspectives. So by having a private endpoint, you've just got another private IP address to hit. So you can get away with just having a private peering.
So you're right in thinking that service endpoints you cannot route from through an express route.
You can, but you have to set up a public or a Microsoft peering, whichever one's the one that's still supported, which then means public IP address space is being shared both ways. So, if your routers are pretty light, you're going to inherit a lot of root space from Microsoft very quickly that you didn't plan to receive.
Cool. All right. So, a storage account that I pre-baked earlier, a bit like Ready, Steady, Cook, is one that I made earlier. So I've got this data lake storage account, which has got all my sensitive information from my laptop. I've got my data lake container. I can't get to that resource. So how do I get to this? So one of the ways that we can do this is actually I've deployed Bastion into my hub VNet, and I've got a VM, which I will log into now. And from the Azure portal here, we can see that actually now I can get into that storage account, and then I've got my text file with all my secrets in clear, open text. Yeah, exactly. Oh, good question.
You could check the storage account access logs if you've got them configured,
Yeah.
but you'll see them as the client IP that's connecting. So you'd see it as the source VM in this case, because at that point it hands over to the client to connect.
And just on the subject of DNS, so if I go to my private endpoint, and if I go to DNS configuration, I've got my FQDN here. If I try and resolve that or do an NS lookup on that, it should resolve to the private IP address, if I've done things right, of that private endpoint. As we can see, that's resolving quite nicely to the private IP address from within that virtual network.
Notice the important part in the middle. So you're getting the response from the 168, which is your DNS. But if you just below where your mouse is, Jonathan, like you've got the .private link injected. So notice that Jonathan looked up the public address space storage account West Europe .dfs.core.windows.net, but the response he got was actually from a CNAME for .private link, which then forces it to go to the private DNS zone. So that's the magic of private link, that why DNS is so buried in it that please set it up correctly. But yeah, that's how it works.
What DNS is your Bastion using? Just default?
Yeah, just the.
So yeah, I take it the VNet that's in, and the VM that you're connected to is
using
in,
the Azure default.
is using, but you've got the private DNS
zone
linked
linked
to that VNet so that it can resolve it.
Yeah, so I've set up the virtual network links, which is important as well too. It's got linked to Spoke, but it's actually linked to the hub. Typo. But yeah. Cool. Right. Am I right to keep this on for the rest of the... Yeah? I need to extend.
Just go into Chrome again.
No, we're good.
You still see...
We've still got it, yeah.
Sure.
If you go, if you play the slides, play the show, we are, no, you're right.
Okay. So go into Chrome and just do stop on that one.
That one, yeah?
Yeah, and then go back in, just do present and share screen. Yeah, entire screen. We'll click.
Yep.
Click again. And then entire screen, and then choose them. You laugh it. Behind your back.
Yeah. Yeah, nice.
Cool. So, first consideration. You lost me? First consideration, funny enough, DNS. You got me? Perfect. So, as Jack mentioned, and as probably we talked about quite a lot, the first consideration is DNS. So it's so important to get this right when implementing private endpoints, because you don't have that luxury with public endpoints with all the DNS being taken care for you. So one of the things I always say when working with my customers is that actually having a well-established landing zone before the implementation of private endpoints is really key. Because if you've got those network foundations already in place, it means that actually implementing private endpoints is a lot more scalable, and it just generally the whole process goes a lot smoother. Connectivity from on-prem. So actually now that I've got my private endpoints, how am I going to connect to this? So I need to start thinking about a site-to-site VPN or do I actually want to use maybe an Azure native solution like Azure Virtual Desktop, Bastion, as I presented here, or actually more recently Azure DevBoxes, which I've used on a recent customer to implement that. Coming in as a consultancy and a third party, it's really key that actually you get buy-in from the IT's organization. So actually, if they need this to be an extension from their on-prem network, I need to make sure that I've got access to those IT resources that can help configure all of that for me. Cost. So Ryan, this was the point that you mentioned. So yeah, cost is a real big thing when it comes to implementing private endpoints. As I mentioned, you're looking at £7 per month per endpoint. And you also need to start thinking about supporting services like virtual machine scale sets, and also actually looking at the SKUs that your resources are provisioning. So for example, function apps, if you're on the standard SKU, they're not supported with private endpoints, and you actually need to start scaling that up to get that. Some resources require special private endpoint configurations. So what I mean by that in particular is Azure Databricks. If anyone's here used Databricks, it's a real pain when it comes to implementing private link. I've got it to work, but it took a few goes the first time. It can reduce developer productivity. So this is a key one. So developers hate it when we're using private endpoints on projects. They generally get access from their own laptops with all their software. They can download things, but actually now they might be pushed into a more secure environment that the customer's enforcing, which will actually put some restrictions on them. There's always firewall and some sort of connectivity issues when implementing private endpoints. So in conclusion, the benefits are that it does increase your security across your infrastructure. It can give you network segregation, and it can actually help comply with regularity requirements. So where previously DevSecOps teams might have been a bit reluctant to provision those resources in the cloud, with the use of private endpoints, that will probably start to be approved. You can access services in Azure from on-prem, and it helps prevent data leakage. So if you've got private endpoints, then it can help, that attack vector that we talked about. So the main drawback is cost. As I mentioned, it's £7 per month per endpoint, which if you have a large platform, that actually the cost can quickly increase. Increased complication on your PaaS resources. So whereas before they could quite easily connect over the public endpoint, actually now you have to start looking at sort of other technologies such as VNet integration, so deploying some of your services within a VNet so it can contact those resources behind the private endpoint. Developer productivity, which I touched upon. And if you're working as a third party or as a consultancy like myself, you need to make sure you get buy-in from those IT departments to help you enable that access. So in summary, I think as the themes, the drum that I've banged, it does increase your security, but you need to evaluate, is the service firewall on my platform sufficient? So do I really need to go as extreme as deploying private endpoints, or actually saying, is my public endpoint accessible from a certain network actually sufficient? They should be used appropriately. So we shouldn't be just by default be slapping private endpoints across all of our platforms. It really should be a process that you go through to evaluate whether that should be done. And quite lastly, private endpoints should be done with careful planning and preparation so that you don't get all the battle scars that I did on my first implementation. Any questions? Sure.
Accessing Microsoft services, or is it like sort of you can access third-party services? I mean, I come from an AWS background,
Okay.
where we've got Private Link, where
So it's VPC, I think, is the AWS equivalent.
no Private Link. So Private Link, I can access third-party PaaS services, like for example, VirtueCrypt,
No,
Cloud
so this,
XSM.
to my knowledge, this is just for Microsoft technologies. Jack will probably confirm that, but private endpoints is solely for Microsoft technologies.
Okay. Are there any plans to expand it so that you can hit up third-party PaaS services?
So private endpoints does, but it uses a technology called private link service under the hood. Now, private link service, you can expand and use yourself to expose your own services and APIs and whatever. As long as you can put a load balancer in front of it, you can expose it via private link.
Okay, this is exactly like
So
the
it's
AWS service, yeah.
I wonder where we got inspiration from. But yes, it's very similar to that. And also you can do it cross-tenant, cross-subscription, overlapping IP address spaces, When you're using it for yourself, the DNS configuration is down to you. You can use what you like. But private endpoints, and this is quite a common mistake that I find a lot of customers make, is they use private endpoints and mean private link.
Okay.
And some of them say private link and they mean private endpoints. And so like private endpoints is purely for connecting to Microsoft PaaS services. Private link service, the underlying technology that makes it all work, anybody can use, you can use, expose anything as long as it's got a load balancer fronting that service.
Okay, that makes sense. What are the private endpoint services it can access?
Oh God, list them all, go.
I thought they only look like there was about 7 or 8.
It's
on
probably
that
easier
bill
to
there.
name the ones that it can't. To be honest.
I would say it's probably nearer like 95% coverage for PaaS services now.
Okay,
So
that's
like
cool.
pretty much everything.
AVD's got
AVD's
it.
now
Yeah,
got it.
AVD.
Yeah, even ARM's got it. So you can lock down your entire Azure tenant to only be accessible over private link. Please don't do it. Please don't do it, because the amount of people that go, that's a really good idea. We can then make only people get to Azure if they're in this on-prem network. Cool. What happens if your VPN dies? You've literally built a data center you can't get into. Like, don't do that. Yeah. But yeah, it supports AVD, supports all of those control plane things now. So yeah, there's been
Azure Analysis Services is the one that comes to mind that it doesn't support. That's the only one that I can think of.
Yeah, no, that's true. But most it does now support. So yeah, private links is available for everything because people love it. Because you get a private IP address and people get fixated by a private IP address.
Then they can't connect to it.
It's secure. It's secure. But I've got one more question, which was you alluded earlier on to the idea of having an endpoint VNet where you have all your private endpoints in that VNet, so then you can cut down on the number and everyone gets to the hub. Is that part of CAF? Sort of like.
Yeah, so we don't suggest centralizing all of your endpoints into a VNet. We say leave them in the application landing zones where they live, like next to the application, because you then don't get VNet peering costs for going across. So you try and reduce the cost.
The reason you have spokes, right?
Yeah, it's the reason you have spokes, but we do say centralize the DNS zones so that they register to. So have your endpoint in an application subscription, but the DNS zone it's linking to is in a hub network so that anybody can resolve it and then route into that specific spoke to get to the endpoint.
Okay.
But I have seen architectures that do, like I literally was working with a customer today that just has, I think they had 27 firewalls of different vendors as they hop through because they believe in defense in depth. Different conversation. But they had really complex routing requirements for their private endpoints and like they just couldn't work out where traffic was going. And actually the solution was that centralize all of your endpoints to go into a separate private endpoints VNet that we can control a lot easier than trying to do it in 100 spokes or whatever. So yeah, I have seen that pattern, not so common, more in a very large environment we would see that pattern, but the DNS zone central, endpoints decentralized.
Okay.
And that is in CAF with policies to support it.
Yeah. So the other thing I was going to say is actually, so when you're doing your deployments, one thing that catches people out is that actually if those private DNS zones are centralized, whatever service principal you're doing for your deployment, you need to make sure it has access to those private DNS zones, or you can do it by policy.
You can do it by policy.
You can link your private endpoints to your DNS by policy.
And Azure Landing Zones has a built-in policy that we manage about 25 to 27 services that have built-in policies for this. So that all you need to do is create the private endpoint, or your app teams need to create the private endpoint, do no DNS configuration because they shouldn't have access to DNS because they can't be trusted. And then the policy kicks in with a managed identity and does the DNS zone linking for them to the correct zone so that your developers can now be fully autonomous and go, don't touch the DNS button because you don't understand it. Just leave that blank. And in 10 minutes, the platform will auto remediate it and create the record for you. So there's a policy built into ALZ that does that for you as well.
Cool. Really good.
Yeah. We need to expand it to more services.
Thank you. So yeah, there's more of a point rather than a question. So another thing to mention about the cost is that there is actually a data transfer fee on it as well. So it's not just the fixed fee of £7 a month. So there's 2 pence per gigabyte or something like that. So I'm doing some work with a customer at the moment where they want to do large volumes of data archiving. So they've got an on-premise storage array. They want to archive it all into Blob. And they've been asking the question, do we do that over private link or internet? And it's become quite an interesting cost conversation because if you think normally there's an egress fee from Azure, but not an ingestion fee. If you put in place private link plus Azure Firewall plus VNet peering, you've got charges going both ways, whereas on the internet you still don't. So we ended up in the conversation about how read and write heavy is your data. Once you've archived it, are you going to read it back? If you're just archiving it and you're never going to read it, the internet is way cheaper. If you are going to read it back again, then express route plus all those other things is cheaper, because yes, you pay more to put it in, but you pay less to get it out. So there's some maths and balancing to be done there as well.
And I would say that to your point, like I loved your summary slide that said, don't use private endpoints by default. I see so many customers fall foul of this. They're like, it's got a private IP address, therefore it's more secure, therefore I'm going to use it, and we must use it for every service. No, don't do that, because DNS gets really complicated, troubleshooting gets really hard, developers hate you, and it does increase the cost. But the other thing to be aware of is be modern, right? Identity is the new security perimeter, right? Networking is the old security perimeter. So if you can actually build into your app and use storage RBAC or Key Vault RBAC or any of those like identity services, that's way more secure than any network you're going to put in place, right? Because somebody will misconfigure the firewall at some stage and let everything through. Like that happens. So if you use identity, nothing can break that, right? You've then got to make an identity-based mishap to expose that account. So using the public endpoint, to Daniel's point, like you absolutely can, and that is probably the best way of doing it, and using identities to secure the access to that if you can. That would be my default approach. Can we not do this with modern authentication and identity? If no, and it's some really legacy, dodgy app that's like off the shelf and the developer won't change it, fine, okay, private endpoint, but not by default. Save yourself some money and complexity. But it's really powerful when you do need it.
Yeah, it does have a place.
It does. It definitely has its place, and especially around large networks and cross-tenant as well. So like between tenant customers, you can share private endpoints between them and not have to set up any networking between them, because you're both in Azure. Azure handles that complex routing between storage accounts for customers. So you can enable some crazy scenarios. DNS gets really complicated when you do cross-customer though, because if you've both got a zone for private link.blob.core.windows.net and one of you tries to resolve an endpoint that doesn't exist in yours but exists in the other one, you need to make sure it's being redirected to the right place. So it gets pretty complex. There's some good articles that I can share links to if anybody's in those scenarios from a couple of GBBs.
When I was kind of looking at them for the first time, I kind of took that approach that you said, bad approach, which is like put it on everything. Just because, stuff like Azure Security Center goes, you've got public access, you need to lock that down. I think it was quite nice in the end to like find things that say, actually, no, you don't even need any access. Like if you want to have like the cloud shell, you can just say which Azure data center you're coming from, and then there's nothing. It's all just nicely firewalled off, and you don't need to allow any access. It doesn't need private access at all. So I suppose like don't hit that fear factor of turn it on. Just go for firewall it or turn it off. You don't actually need access to it anywhere.
Super hot topic. It always comes up, but I love it. So any more questions? No? Anything more from you, John?
No, I hope you all found that useful.
I thought that was fantastic. Great conversation. So thank you very much. All right, we'll wrap up without our slides because standard stuff. Thank you again to both our speakers, to Steve and to Jonathan. Both have trekked a fair way to get here tonight to talk as well, so much appreciated. He's come off mute again. I can hear myself. There we go. As always, please do sign up on the Meetup and let us know if any of you are interested in talking, or any of you got a session you're going to run. We'll confirm the November date very, very soon. But stay tuned on Meetup because we already have that out there. And if any of you do want to talk, let us know. But apart from that, thank you as always for coming. Thank you to Runway East for hosting us again, as always, and the support from the Silicon Brighton team. Much appreciated. And we will see you all in November. So thank you and see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.